The weight of a father's love. John Dawson had never known luxury, but he had known love. As a single father, he worked tirelessly to provide for his only son, Michael. The small mechanic shop he owned barely made enough to cover their expenses, but he never let Michael see his struggles. He hid his exhaustion behind a reassuring smile, his worn-out hands constantly working, his heart filled with nothing but love and hope for his son's future. Every morning before dawn, John would wake up, his body aching from the previous day's work, and prepare breakfast for Michael. The smell of eggs and toast filled their small kitchen, a simple yet consistent reminder that no matter how hard life became, John would always make sure his son started the day with a warm meal. Michael, still groggy from sleep, would often stumble into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, unaware that his father had already been awake for hours, planning his day around ensuring Michael's happiness and comfort. After breakfast, John would pack his son's school lunch with whatever he could afford. Some days, it was just a simple sandwich and an apple; other days, he managed to add a small treat, a rare indulgence that Michael always appreciated. What Michael didn't know was that on the days his lunchbox was full, John often went without food himself, using the last of their money to make sure his son was taken care of. John's mechanic shop was a humble place, a small garage filled with the scent of oil and metal, where he spent long hours fixing cars for little pay. The work was tough, leaving his hands calloused and his back sore, but he never complained. The grease-stained overalls he wore every day told the story of his hard labor, but beneath them was a man whose only goal in life was to see his son succeed. To the world, John was just another blue-collar worker, another man lost in the struggle of survival. But to Michael, he was a giant, strong, unwavering, and full of love. John never missed a school event, no matter how tired he was. He stood in the back during school plays, clapped the loudest at football games, and helped with late-night homework, even if it meant sacrificing the little rest he had. There were nights when Michael would wake up to the sound of his father coughing from exhaustion or groaning softly from the pain in his joints. But every morning, John would still wake up before the sun, put on a brave face, and repeat the routine, as if his struggles were invisible, as if love alone fueled him. Michael didn't yet understand the depths of his father's sacrifices, but he felt the warmth of his love every single day. Michael grew up watching his father work late into the night, fixing cars and broken engines, his back aching from the long hours. He noticed how John's clothes grew older, how his shoes became more worn, yet he always made sure Michael had a clean uniform for school. There were times when Michael caught his father rubbing his temples after a long shift, exhaustion lining his face like deep-etched scars, but John never once complained. Despite their financial struggles, John made sure Michael never felt deprived. He found ways to fix up second-hand textbooks, sewed torn backpacks, and mended Michael's shoes so he never had to feel different from the other kids at school. When Michael needed a new laptop for his studies, John quietly sold his old toolbox, one he had cherished for years, to make sure his son had what he needed to succeed. Michael was a bright student, excelling in academics and extracurricular activities. When he got accepted into a prestigious university, he rushed home with excitement, his acceptance letter clutched in his hands. But as he sat down at the dinner table, reality sank in. The tuition was more than they could ever afford. His heart clenched as he looked across at his father, who was silently reading the acceptance letter with pride in his eyes. Before Michael could voice his concerns, John simply patted his shoulder and said, "You focus on your studies. Let me handle the rest." Michael wanted to protest, but something in his father's eyes, the same unwavering determination that had built their lives, made him stop. He had no idea what sacrifices his father would make to fulfill that promise, but he knew one thing for certain: John Dawson would never let him down. John sold his beloved mechanic shop, the place he had built with his own hands, just to pay for Michael's education. The garage that had been his life's work, his sanctuary, was now gone. The tools he had used for decades, the very things that had put food on their table, were no longer his. But John did not mourn the loss, he only saw the opportunity it gave his son. To make ends meet, he took up multiple jobs, cleaning offices at night, working as a janitor in the mornings, and fixing cars on the weekends in borrowed garages. His hands, already rough from years of labor, grew more calloused, and his body weaker. But his determination never wavered. Every paycheck went straight to Michael's tuition, every hour of exhaustion was a step closer to ensuring his son had a better future. Michael, unaware of the extent of his father's sacrifices, excelled in his studies. He was thriving in university, earning top grades and receiving praise from professors. He dreamed of a future where he could give back to the man who had given him everything, unaware that his father was barely sleeping, barely eating, just to keep his dream alive. One evening, after a long shift cleaning an office building, John sat on a park bench, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He watched other fathers walking with their children, laughing, playing things he had rarely allowed himself to do. He wondered if Michael would ever truly understand what he had given up, what he had endured. But then he shook the thought away. It didn't matter. This was what fathers did. They sacrificed so their children wouldn't have to. Months turned into years. John's body grew weaker, his once strong frame now thin and frail. His cough became persistent, but he ignored it. His clothes grew older, but he spent every penny on Michael instead of himself. The sleepless nights became longer, and the days felt heavier. Still, he pushed forward. At one point, Michael called home excitedly, telling John about an internship opportunity at a prestigious firm. John listened, pride swelling in his heart. He hid the pain in his voice, congratulating his son with warmth, even as his own body betrayed him. Then, one day, John collapsed. Alone, on a dimly lit sidewalk, his body finally gave in. A kind stranger helped him to a nearby clinic, where he was told the truth: his years of overworking, lack of rest, and neglecting his own health had taken their toll. His heart was weak. His lungs were failing. The doctor urged him to slow down, but John only had one thought: Michael's tuition isn't fully paid yet. So, he pushed on, ignoring the pain, hiding the truth from his son. Because that's what a father does. He sacrifices, no matter the cost. Years later, Michael graduated with honors, his heart filled with excitement and dreams of the future. He had secured a high-paying job at a prestigious company, a position that promised stability and success. The moment he received his first paycheck, he knew exactly where he wanted to go to his father, the man who had given up everything for him. Michael rushed home, eager to share the news, already imagining the proud look on his father's face. But when he arrived, the sight before him made his heart drop. John was sitting in the dimly lit living room, his hands trembling as he tried to steady a cup of tea. The strong, resilient man Michael had always looked up to now appeared frail, the years of endless labor etched into every wrinkle on his face, every callus on his hands. His body, once sturdy, looked weak, worn down by years of silent sacrifices. "Dad?" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. John looked up and smiled, the same warm smile that had reassured Michael through every storm. "You're home, son," he said softly, his voice tired but filled with love. It wasn't until that moment that Michael truly saw it: the sacrifices his father had made, the struggles he had endured, all for him. He noticed the faded patches on John's clothes, the worn-out shoes barely holding together. The weight of unspoken hardships pressed against Michael's chest like a heavy stone. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" Michael whispered, falling to his knees before John. Tears streamed down his face as he grasped his father's rough hands, hands that had built his future at the cost of their own strength. John exhaled, his expression calm, unwavering. "Because a father's love asks for nothing in return." Michael shook his head, guilt washing over him in waves. "But you suffered, Dad. You gave up everything." John chuckled softly, his thumb gently wiping away a tear from Michael's cheek. "And I'd do it all over again, son. Every single sacrifice, every sleepless night, it was never a burden. It was my privilege to see you succeed." Overwhelmed, Michael buried his face in his father's lap, sobbing like he was a child again. He had spent his whole life chasing success, not realizing that his father had quietly paid the price for it. That night, Michael made a silent vow: he would not let his father's sacrifices be in vain. He would ensure that John never had to lift another heavy burden, never had to work another grueling hour just to survive. And for the first time in years, John allowed himself to rest, knowing that his son had finally understood the depth of his love. Chapter 5: A Son's Gratitude. Determined to repay his father, Michael set out on a mission to restore the life his father had sacrificed for him. He spent weeks tracking down the old mechanic shop, only to find it abandoned, its walls covered in dust, its sign faded by time. The place that had once been his father's pride and livelihood now stood empty, a silent testament to all that John had given up. Michael made a decision that day: he would rebuild it, just as his father had once built his future. Using his first few paychecks, he purchased the shop and hired workers to renovate it. Every detail was restored to its original form, from the familiar grease-stained counters to the shelves lined with John's favorite tools. When the day finally came, Michael drove his father to the shop, the anticipation swelling in his chest. As they arrived, John's eyes widened in disbelief. The once abandoned shop now stood before him, alive again, its sign newly polished: Dawson & Son Auto Repairs. John stepped out of the car, his hands trembling as he reached for the door. He ran his fingers over the familiar workbenches, his eyes glistening with tears. Michael handed him a set of keys, his voice thick with emotion. "Now, you can do what you love, without worry. You don't have to work to survive anymore, Dad. You can work because you want to." John turned to his son, tears spilling down his weathered face. He pulled Michael into a tight embrace, his voice shaking. "You didn't have to do this, son." Michael smiled, his own eyes misty. "And you didn't have to sacrifice everything for me. But you did. This is my way of saying thank you." For the first time in years, John allowed himself to breathe, to dream again. He no longer carried the weight of sacrifice alone. His son had not only succeeded but had remembered, had honored everything he had done. As the sun set over the town, father and son stood together in the doorway of the shop, one man who had given everything, and another who had finally given something back. And in that moment, John knew his sacrifices had never been in vain. The legacy of love. Years passed, and Michael never forgot his father's lessons of resilience and love. He raised his own children with the same devotion, ensuring that John's sacrifices were never forgotten. And so, the legacy of a father's love lived on, not in words, but in actions, in sacrifices, and in the quiet, unwavering strength that only a parent could give. A message to everyone: a parent's love is the purest form of sacrifice. Never take it for granted. If you have the chance, show gratitude while you still can. Sometimes, the greatest way to say thank you is not in words, but in the way you live your life.